They called her cast off. They wrote her name at the bottom of the tithe ledger, below the grain sacks and the tallow bricks, and they handed her to the king's men without ceremony. The pack alpha who had branded her unworthy stood on his hall steps and watched the cart pull away, and he smiled. He should not have smiled, because the king who received her was about to do something no sovereign of the Shadowfang seat had done in living memory. He was going to stand before 12 council members, before every ranked wolf in the great hall, before the man who had discarded her as though she were a spoiled season's offering, and he was going to say her name. Not as a ward, not as a servant, as his. This is what happened in the year 1073, on the night of the waning veil, when an Omega the pack had been told to forget came to the king's seat and refused to be invisible. The night Aldrich staged the rejection, Frost had already locked the ground of Harrow village so hard that the torchlight rang off it. Seren had stood in the packed earth ring behind the meeting hall, the 12 elders of her birth pack arranged in a loose crescent before her, and she had not wept. She had wanted to, the pressure of it sitting high and burning beneath her collarbone, but she understood even then that weeping would be taken as confirmation. That the tears of an Omega before her pack alpha were simply evidence that she had known all along she was unworthy and had tried to hide it. Aldrich had not bothered to make it long. He was not a man who enjoyed the texture of cruelty, only its outcomes. He had spoken the formal words in a flat voice, the repudiation clause that the pack law allowed a paired alpha to invoke inside the first year of a claimed bond, and he had placed the brand against her wrist before she could move. The iron was cold. That surprised her. She had expected it to be heated, had prepared herself for the smell of burning skin, and instead it was simply cold iron pressed hard enough to bruise the bone, and the mark it left was a pale crescent scar that whitened further whenever the temperature dropped. The elders witnessed it. The registry parchment was signed by Aldrich's own hand and filed with the pack recorder, or so Seren had been told. She had not been allowed to see it. What she had not yet known was that the parchment was a forgery. That the original document, the one recording the first claim bond between a pack alpha and an omega of the Veldris bloodline, had never been formally dissolved. Ren, the elder healer who had trained Seren's hands in the work of grinding and distilling and knowing what root could save and what root could kill, had taken that original parchment from the recorder's shelf the morning after the staged rejection and hidden it in the lining of her medicine case. Ren had not told Seren. She had only taken Seren's burned and shaking hands in hers that night, examined the bruised crescent, and said very quietly that some things the law thought settled were not settled at all. Seren had carried those words without understanding them for the better part of 3 months, which was how long it took for Aldrich to arrange her placement in the autumn tithe. If you have ever watched a cart loaded for tribute to the king's seat, you know that the practice involves a particular cruelty of categorization. The tribute master catalogued items by value and by perishability, and Seren was entered under the heading of necessary service labor, which placed her above the cured hides, but below the rolled silver bars. She sat on a plank across the back of the cart and watched Harrow village shrink behind her. She carried a satchel with Ren's grinding tools inside it, the small iron pestle and the flat stone and the parcelled dried veil root, because Ren had pressed it into her hands at the cart's wheel and said the king's keep would have need of a healer's knowledge, and Seren would do well to be useful. Seren had not told Ren she doubted that. She had simply taken the satchel and let the cart carry her north. The king's seat was called Veldenmere, and it rose from the frozen gorge country like something the mountain had pushed out of its own stone. Seren saw it first from 3 miles distant, the outer walls gray against a sky the color of old iron, smoke from the keep's chimneys rising in thin straight lines because the air was so cold it had no motion left. The tribute master told her to keep her face down when they passed through the outer gate. She kept her face level instead, and the gate guards looked at her briefly and then looked away, which was what she had learned to expect from people who registered her rank before they registered her person. She was assigned a cot in the lower servants' corridor and a duty list written in the keep, steward's cramped hand. The list ran to 11 items. Most of them were unremarkable. The last one was not. The last item read, night attendance at the lower cell, ring 7, no mention to day staff, no record in the corridor log. The steward who handed her the list had not met her eyes when she reached that item. He had said only that a certain prisoner required tending, that the usual healers had declined the assignment, and that she had been selected because she was new and because her satchel contained the appropriate materials. He had said this in a tone that suggested he was repeating words given to him rather than words he had chosen. Seren had asked who the prisoner was. The steward had said that was not a question the list invited. She had gone that first night without expectation, carrying a lamp and the satchel and a covered bowl of broth from the kitchen, walking the stone corridor that curved downward from the main cellars into the bedrock of Veldenmir's foundations. Ring 7 was the deepest of the cell rings, and the cold there was a different quality than the cold above, a stillness that felt pressurized, as though the stone itself were pressing inward. The torches in the corridor were few and far apart, and her lamp cast more shadow than light against the walls. The cell door was iron-braced oak, with a small barred window at eye height. She looked through the bars before she drew back the bolt. The man inside was chained at the wrist to an anchor ring set high in the far wall, which meant he was standing, or nearly standing. His weight settled back on his heels and his head dropped forward. His breathing was audible from the doorway, a labored, too slow rhythm that told her something was wrong in his blood before she could see his face. The chains were iron, not silver, but that told her nothing yet. The lamplight reached him in pieces. When she opened the door and stepped in, he raised his head. Seren had grown up in a pack. She knew what an alpha's presence felt like in a room, the particular thickening of the air, the way her own pulse adjusted. She had felt it from Aldrich across 10 feet of cold ground many times, had learned to read it as a signal to be carefully still. What she felt from this man in the chain was not that. It was not pressure. It was not the warning frequency of a dominant wolf marking his radius. It was something else. Something her body registered below the level of her thinking. A warmth that moved upward from her sternum in the moment his eyes found hers. A catch of breath that she could not explain as fear, because fear she knew the shape of exactly, and this was not its shape. She rationalized it as the lamp, the warmth of a flame carried into cold air, settling on skin. She set the bowl down on the stone ledge near the door and crossed toward him, and with each step the warmth grew more specific, not ambient, but directional, as though it were coming from him, rather than from her lamp. The scent of him reached her before she was fully close, and it was not the damp stone smell of confinement she had expected. It was something older, deeper, green beneath the surface cold, like the earth in early spring found under a layer of frost you had not expected. Her hands went still at her sides. He said nothing. His breathing continued its labored rhythm. His eyes tracked her with the focused, effortful attention of someone spending significant will on a simple act. She had seen wolfsbane poisoning twice in her work with Wren, and what she saw now matched neither instance precisely. His pupils were wide for the lamplight, the muscle along his jaw working in an irregular clench, and the skin of his wrists above the manacle cuffs had a faint silver-gray discoloration she had learned to associate with compounds that suppressed the shift. But this was something more deliberate than wolfsbane alone. She could smell the secondary note beneath the wolfsbane's bitterness, something mineral and organic together, a particular decay. Veil root corruption, used as a binding agent to make the wolfsbane's effect persist. She had read of it in Wren's notes, but never encountered it in a living patient. She did not yet know his name. She tended him that first night without speaking much, cleaning the site of a wound at his right shoulder where the compound appeared to have been introduced, applying a drawing poultice from her satchel, and leaving the broth within reach of his chained hands. As she worked, he watched her, not with the appraising look of a man cataloging a servant, with a steadiness she was unused to from anyone ranked above her, a steadiness that did not require her to perform smallness in return. When she turned to go, he spoke. His voice was rougher than it should have been, scored by whatever the compound had done to his throat. He said, "You were in the tithe cart." She stopped at the door. She said yes. He said, "Which pack sent you?" She told him Harrow. The silence that followed was short but weighted, and she did not know what it meant. She left without asking his name, which she recognized even then as a peculiar omission, and she went back up the curved stone corridor with her lamp and her empty bowl, and that warmth still sitting in her sternum like something she had swallowed without meaning to. The keep steward told her the next morning that she had done well and should return that evening. She returned for 5 more nights. 6 tending visits in total, each one longer than the last. On the second night, he told her his name without her asking. He said it in the same flat declarative way he said everything, as though he were stating a fact about the weather rather than introducing himself to a servant girl. "Marcus," he said. She absorbed this and did not betray the full weight of what it meant, because she was standing in Ring 7 of Veldenmir's foundations with the Shadowfang Alpha King chained to a wall. And the implications of that were large enough to require a moment of stillness before she could place them. On the third night, he reached toward the satchel with his chained hands before she had opened it, not grabbing, not demanding, simply moving as though familiar with its contents, and then stopping himself. The gesture was its own small disclosure. A man accustomed to reaching for things and then catching himself mid-reach, because reaching had become briefly impossible. She had asked what he needed. He had said nothing, the single flat syllable of a man who had decided not to want things in order to avoid the particular cost of wanting. She took out the drawing poultice anyway, and reapplied it without asking again, and the muscle in his jaw unclenched by a degree she measured carefully. On the 4th night, she brought veil root from her satchel's inner parcel, not the full antidote preparation but the raw dried root, and held it where he could see it. His eyes sharpened. She said she knew what the compound was. She said she could prepare the antidote in 2 more nights if he could tell her the concentration they had used, because the drawing poultice was managing the wound site but not addressing the binding agent in his blood. He said nothing for long enough that she thought he would refuse. Then he described the compound's symptoms in precise clinical language that told her he had been trained in it, or that someone had described it to him in the hours before his confinement with enough detail that he had memorized it. The concentration was high, higher than anything Wren's notes had prepared her for. She told him she would need to double the veil root preparation, which meant grinding on both stones simultaneously, which she could not do without burning her palms on the secondary stone's reactive surface. Wren had warned her of this. The veil root's active compounds released a corroding oil when ground against iron, and the flat stone Wren had given her was not iron, but the pestle was, and the heat generated at that intersection was enough to blister skin if the work continued past the first few minutes. For a double preparation, the grinding would take closer to an hour. He said, "Do not injure yourself on my account." She looked at him directly for the first time without the mediation of her task, and she said that she would decide what was worth injuring herself for. His jaw tightened again, differently this time. She left to prepare the antidote. On the 5th night, she was grinding when she heard voices in the upper corridor. 2 men speaking in the low, carrying tone of people who believe the stone walls are keeping their words private. One voice she recognized as Devon, the name she had heard the steward say once with the careful neutrality of a man who feared the person he was naming. The other voice she did not recognize at first, and then she did, because she had grown up hearing it. Aldrich had come to Veldenmir. She set the pestle down and listened. Devon was reporting on the compound's progress, on the concentration's hold, on the estimate that the Shadowfang King's strength would be too suppressed to challenge the council's quorum for another 8 days. Aldrich's voice was satisfied in the way it got when a plan was running on schedule. He said that 8 days was sufficient. He said that at the next full council session, he would table the motion for the king's execution on grounds of incapacitation, which under the emergency provisions of the old pack law gave the council authority to install a regent. He said the Omega the Harrow pack had sent in the tithe should be registered as treaty goods and held for transfer to the Northern Coalition as a goodwill offering. Treaty goods. The phrase landed in her stomach with all the weight of the cold iron brand. She stood in the corridor outside Ring 7 with the pestle still in her hand and understood that she had perhaps 3 days before the plan was in motion, and that the antidote preparation she was currently burning her palms to produce was not only a healer's act, it was the only counter-move available on this board. She went back in and finished the grinding. When she entered the cell on the 6th night with the completed antidote, she was carrying the small clay vessel in both hands because the burns across her palms made gripping difficult, and she had bound them in linen strips from the kit in her satchel. But the binding was inadequate against the vessel's heat, and she was moving carefully. He saw her hands before she reached the ledge. Something shifted in his face that she had not seen there in 5 nights of watching him. Not the clinical attention he gave her work. Not the flat refusal to want. Something stripped, quick, immediately controlled. But she had been watching that face across 6 evenings in lamplight, and she caught it in the moment before the control reasserted. He said, "Your hands." She said they would heal. She uncovered the vessel and explained the preparation in the same calm voice she had used for every step of the 6 nights' work: the dosage, the interval, the expected timeline for the compound to clear. He took the vessel from her carefully, his chained hands curving around it without touching hers, and he drank without looking away from her face. Then he said, "Who told you what they were planning?" She told him what she had heard in the corridor. The silence that followed had a different quality than any preceding it. The air in the cell, which had felt for 6 nights like a held breath, now felt like a held breath about to release. The lamp between them burned steadier than physics should have allowed, the flame barely moving in dead air. He said, in a voice that had more of its natural register back than any of the preceding nights, "You could have left, taken what you heard, and negotiated your own position with it." She said she had not thought of that. He said, "I think you thought of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had thought of it and found it did not interest her. She said she was not in the habit of trading in other people's circumstances for her own safety. She said this in the same tone she used to say everything, without emphasis, simply as a fact about herself that he could receive or discard. In the thin circle of lamplight she could see the compound's discoloration already beginning to recede from the skin above his cuffs. His breathing had steadied through the hour she had been in the cell. The shift was returning in the small, measurable signs: the color in his face, the quality of his stillness, the way the room's air organized differently around him than it had on any of the previous 5 nights. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she had to resist the impulse to look away, not from deference but from the bare weight of being looked at that way by someone who was not cataloging her rank or her station. He said, "The Harrow pack recorded a rejection against you." She said yes. He said, "It was Aldrich's pack." She said yes. He said, "The bond was never dissolved." She understood then that he knew more than he had been letting on, that whatever intelligence network had been severed by his confinement had not been entirely cut, that some information had reached him even in Ring 7. She said she had suspected that, but had no proof of it. He said, "There is a woman, an elder healer from Harrow." Seren's breath held in her chest. He said her name would need to be sent for, that what was coming in the next 2 days would require a witness the council could not dismiss. He said this the way he said everything, as a flat declarative, except that his eyes did not leave hers, and she had learned across 6 nights exactly what the flat declaratives were covering. She said she would send for Wren herself. He said softly in a register she had not yet heard from him. You know what it means, what I am about to say to them. She told him she understood. He said, I am not asking you to accept it out of debt. The antidote does not purchase this. Nothing purchases this. She looked at him in the lamplight. This man who had spent 6 nights receiving her care with careful economy, and who was now, in the 12 hours before a council session intended to end his life, speaking to her without the flat economy at all. She thought of the cold iron brand on her wrist. She thought of Aldrich standing on his hall steps watching her cart move away. She thought of Wren pressing the satchel into her hands and saying that some things the law thought settled were not settled at all. She said that she had not come for 6 nights because she intended to be purchased. She said that. He said, I know. If you want to know what happened next, stay where you are. The council session was at noon the following day, and the 12 members were already seated by the time the morning light reached the chamber's high windows. Seren had sent for Wren before dawn, a message carried by one of the outer gate runners who owed his continued employment to a favor Seren had not been aware she was collecting until she needed it. The message was 4 words. She trusted Wren to understand them. Aldrich arrived in the council chamber with the particular ease of a man who has already counted his votes. He wore the formal mantle of the Harrow Pack Alpha, the black and silver wool that marked his grade in the ranked hierarchy of the outer packs, and he sat at the council table as though sitting at that table were simply an extension of his usual authority. Devon stood behind the chamber's side door, unregistered in the seating chart, present because Aldrich preferred to have a man near the exits. The 12 council members arranged themselves in the formal crescent, and the chamber steward called the session to order. Aldrich rose and presented the motion. He spoke well. He had prepared the motion with care, citing the emergency provisions, citing the king's documented incapacitation, citing the provisions under which a regent council could assume governance pending recovery or succession. He cited these provisions in the tone of a man doing a reluctant administrative duty rather than a man dismantling a kingdom for personal territory, and 4 of the 12 council members were nodding before he finished. He did not know that Marcus had been free of the compound for 14 hours. He did not know that the 2 guards Devon had bribed to maintain the concealment of Ring 7 had found, upon arriving for their morning duty, that the cell door stood open and the anchor ring had been pulled from the wall. The chamber doors came inward with enough force that the iron brace bar, which weighed as much as a large man, cleared the mounting bolts and struck the far wall. The sound was a single enormous concussive crack that took the breath from the room and brought 12 council members to their feet in one motion. Marcus walked through the door. He was not at full strength. Seren could see that from where she stood at the chamber's side wall, where she had positioned herself before the session opened. The compound still had traces in his blood, enough that his movements had a cost in them, a deliberate quality that was not quite the fluid authority of a healthy, dominant wolf. He walked as someone who was paying for each step and had decided the price was acceptable. He was still the most powerful presence in the room by a margin that was not close. The assembly that had been on its feet stayed on its feet. Nobody moved toward him. Aldrich's prepared composure held for approximately 4 seconds, and then it did not. Marcus stood at the head of the table and looked at the 12 council members with the expression of a man who has returned to a house where someone has rearranged the furniture without permission and is deciding what to do about it. He looked at Aldrich. Aldrich's mouth had opened once and closed again. Marcus said, "Bring the woman forward." Seren stepped away from the wall. She walked to the center of the chamber's floor and stood there in the tithe servant's plain gray wool she had arrived in 3 weeks earlier, with the burned linen strips around her palms and Wren's satchel at her shoulder, and she met Aldrich's eyes across the table without looking away. Aldrich found his voice. He said this was irregular, that the servant girl from the Harrow tithe had no standing in a council proceeding. Marcus said, She has standing equivalent to any woman I name before this council. State your name for the chamber record. She said it. Seren. Her given name first. Then the bloodline name, Veldris, which she had not spoken aloud in 3 years, because Aldrich's registry filing had erased it from her pack's formal records. The word felt strange and clean in her mouth, like cold water after a long, dry stretch. A door at the back of the chamber opened and Wren came in. Wren was a small woman, compact and gray-haired, and carrying the kind of authority that does not require announcement. The authority of someone who has been correct about important things for a long time. She set her medicine case on the nearest clear surface, opened the inner lining, and removed a folded parchment that she placed in front of the nearest council member. She said, in a clear, flat voice, that the document was the original first claim registry filing for the bond between Aldrich of Harrow and Seren of the Veldris bloodline, and that no dissolution record existed against it, because no formal dissolution had ever been filed. She said this looking at Aldrich. Aldrich said the dissolution was on record with the Harrow Pack recorder. Wren said she had checked the Harrow records personally 3 months earlier, and the dissolution parchment bore Aldrich's seal, but not the bonded party's signature, which the Pack law had required for valid dissolution since the third revision of the compact, which was passed in the year 1049. The council member who was holding the document looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at Davon. Davon moved toward the side door. He did not reach it. The 2 men Marcus had brought through the main door were already at the side wall, and Davon found them between him and his exit with a speed that ended his movement. One of the men had a hand at Davon's collar. The other had the small clay vessel from Ring 7, which he set on the table in front of the council without being asked. Marcus named the compound. He named its origin. He described the supply mechanism, Davon's sourcing, the bribery of the 2 Ring 7 guards, and the communication between Davon and Aldrich that Seren had overheard in the lower corridor. He named the date of each transaction with the precision of a man who had spent 6 days in a cell with nothing to do but think, and who had been visited each night by a healer who was also a witness. The chamber was very still. Marcus said to the 12 council members, "You were brought here to vote on my execution, arranged by a Pack Alpha who staged a bond rejection against an Omega of the Veldris bloodline to erase her standing and remove her from the registry before she could contest his governance. He then placed her in my tithe as service labor, believing she would be too unranked for anyone to listen to. He was wrong about that." He looked at Aldrich for a moment. Aldrich had sat down, not from weariness, from the specific deflation of a man whose mathematics have failed him publicly. Marcus said, "The rejection was unlawful. The dissolution was fraudulent. The bond on record is the original registry document, witnessed and sealed, which has not been lawfully dissolved." He paused. He looked at Seren. His voice did not change register, but she heard in it the thing she had heard in the cell in the last hour of their last night. The thing he had spent 6 days carefully managing and had stopped managing before dawn. He said, "She was never rejected. The assembly was simply blind." 12 council members were on their feet, not in protest. In the old gesture of formal recognition, the open palm pressed to the chest that Pack law prescribed for the acknowledgement of a named Luna before a council quorum. They did it one by one, and the last one was the member who had been nodding at Aldrich's motion 4 minutes earlier. Aldrich was stripped of his Pack Alpha rank by formal council motion. The vote was unanimous and immediate, and it was recorded in the chamber log in the steward's cramped hand, with the date and the hour and the names of all 12 witnesses. The Harrow Pack would pass to an elder council pending new selection. The registry of Seren's erasure was voided and replaced with the original Veldris filing. Davon was held for binding and sentencing under the laws governing assassination of a ruling alpha, and when the men who held him walked him out through the broken main doors into the frozen courtyard, The morning light showed 3 tracker wolves already in position at the gate, sent ahead by Marcus in the hours before dawn, which told Seren that the restoration had been planned with more preparation than the chamber scene had suggested. Aldrich left the chamber between 2 of the king's guard, and the last thing she saw of him was the back of his formal mantle, the black and silver wool that had marked his authority for 11 years, going out the door into a world where it marked nothing anymore. The chamber quieted in the particular way of a room where something enormous has just resolved. The council members were still standing. Ren had come to Seren's side and taken her wrapped hands in hers, examining the linen strips with a healer's focused displeasure that was also, underneath its surface, a particular kind of tenderness. Marcus came from the head of the table. He stopped in front of her. The chamber was watching. The 12 council members were watching. 2 of his own guard were watching from the door. He was still paying for each step, still moving with the deliberate cost of a man who had climbed out of a cell on 14 hours of partial recovery. And he stood in front of her with all of that visible and did not try to conceal it. He said, quietly enough that it was almost only for her, "I told you I would not ask you to accept this from debt." She said she remembered. He said, "I am asking you to consider it on its own terms." She looked at him. The scent of him, the green beneath frost thing that had moved up through her sternum on the first night, was fully present now without the compound's bitter overlay, and it was so distinctly right in her lungs that her eyes stung for a moment in a way she had been disciplined enough to prevent for 3 years. Since the cold iron brand. Since the cart pulling away from Harrow Village. She said yes. He went to one knee on the chamber's stone floor. She had not expected that. Not the gesture itself, which she had understood intellectually was coming, but the specific sound of it, the weight of him settling on the cold stone. A man who had spent 6 days chained to a wall by someone who wanted him permanently reduced, choosing to kneel not from reduction, but from its opposite. The distinction was enormous. The 12 council members went to their knees in sequence. The third before the last had finished rising, a wave of descent across the formal crescent that took perhaps 7 seconds. Ren did not kneel. Ren put her hand flat on Seren's back and kept it there, which was better. Marcus looked up at her from the cold stone floor of the chamber, where 12 people had just sat down to vote on his death. He said formally, for the record, for the chamber steward's cramped pen, "Seren of the Veldris bloodline. Let this council witness that I speak her name as my own, before rank and registry and pack law, and that no other claim supersedes it." Outside, the morning light was doing something on the frozen courtyard stones, reflecting back from the ice in a way that sent pale light up through the chamber's low windows and laid it across the floor in wavering lines. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing in a pack hierarchy undone by a council session at noon is simple. The Harrow Pack's transition required documentation and the assignment of an interim elder council, which Ren supervised with the particular efficiency of someone who had been preparing for it longer than anyone knew. The 2 bribed Ring 7 guards were processed under the guard law protocols, and their testimony confirmed Devon's sourcing arrangements, which in turn confirmed 4 of the 5 council members who had received material benefit from Aldrich's arrangement and needed to be separately reviewed. 3 of those 4 resigned their seats voluntarily before the review concluded, which was a form of efficiency Marcus appeared to find satisfactory without finding it surprising. Devon's sentencing was public and swift. The penalty for attempted assassination of a ruling alpha under Veldenmir's law was exile and registry erasure, which in practical terms meant the same thing that had been done to Seren, stripped of name and standing in the pack world, except that Seren's erasure had been fraudulent and his was lawful, and the distinction held. He was walked out through the outer gate in view of the assembled household, guards and servants and the ranked wolves of the king's court, and Seren stood at the inner yard wall and watched him go without feeling the satisfaction she had expected. What she felt instead was something quieter, the particular absence of a weight she had been carrying since the night in the corridor outside Ring 7, when his voice had told her she was going to be catalogued as treaty goods. The weight lifted. She breathed. Wren moved in from the lower servants' corridor to a set of rooms near the keep's healing hall, which she arranged with the same brisk authority she had brought to the chamber testimony. She refused a formal title for her position, saying that elder healers in her experience worked better without titles, and took on the management of the keep's medicine stores with an efficiency that had the junior healers quietly in awe within a week. The rejection brand on Seren's wrist had always been a pale crescent, cool to the touch, whitening in cold weather. In the third week after the council session, she noticed it during the morning washing, the way she noticed it every morning by habit, and found that it had gone. Not faded. Gone. The skin beneath it the same even tone as the surrounding skin, unmarked, as though the iron had never been pressed there. Wren, when shown, examined it without surprise. She said some marks resolved when the legal fiction sustaining them was dissolved. She said this in her flat, practical voice, but her hand on Seren's wrist stayed a moment longer than the examination required. On the morning of the formal recognition ceremony, the keep's great hall held more wolves than it had at any gathering in the 3 years of Marcus's reign. The pack alphas of the 9 allied territories had been summoned, all 9 arriving within the 2-day window, which was a speed that told Seren something about how word moved in the Shadowfang network, even when its king was supposed to be incapacitated. The 12 council members were seated in the formal crescent again, different from the emergency session in every surface detail. The formal robes, the candles ranked along the table's edge, the chamber steward in his ceremonial chain. But the same 12. 11 of them the same, one seat newly filled by the youngest of the Harrow elders, a woman Wren had recommended. Seren walked the hall in the pale gray-blue wool they had given her, with Wren at her left shoulder and the satchel gone from her hands because there was nothing left to carry in it, the veil route finished, the work done. Marcus stood at the dais. He was at full strength. The 14 hours of partial recovery in the council chamber had been replaced by 3 weeks of it, and the compound was entirely cleared, and the air of the great hall organized around him in the way that told every wolf present where the apex of the room was. He had not made it subtle. She understood that the lack of subtlety was itself a message to the assembled pack alphas, a demonstration that the reported incapacitation had been temporary and was now entirely resolved, and they should all adjust their calculations accordingly. He looked at her when she entered. The distance between the hall's great doors and the dais was 30 paces, and he watched every one of them. She walked without looking down. At the dais step she stopped, and he came down the single step to stand on the hall floor with her, which was not in the ceremony's formal script, and she heard one of the assembled alphas shift his weight and then become still. Marcus took her hands. He turned them over, palms up, and looked at the healed burns, faint pink lines across the skin of both palms, the only mark remaining on her from Ring 7. His thumbs did not move over them. He simply held her hands open in his and looked, and the hall was quiet enough that she could hear the torches. He named her before the assembly in the formal mode, the full binding registry phrase that the chamber steward's pen was already moving to record. He named her by the Veldris bloodline restored. He named her as his Luna, his queen, his witnessed mate before pack law and council record, and the 9 territories gathered alphas. The 9 alphas went to their knees. The 12 council members followed. The assembled wolves of the keep's household, guards and runners and kitchen staff and the stable workers who had crowded to the hall's back wall to see, descended in a long, slow wave from the center outward, until the only people standing on the great hall's floor were Marcus and Seren and Wren, who was standing at Seren's shoulder with the medicine case at her feet and her arms folded, watching the assembly kneel with the expression of someone who has waited a long time for a particular thing to happen and is now watching it happen exactly as expected. The morning light came through the hall's eastern windows in long, pale shafts, reaching the stone floor between the kneeling rows, and where it fell, it picked out the dust of 3 weeks of gathered activity. The preparation for this morning, ground underfoot, and now rising in small motes through the cold indoor air. Seren looked at the kneeling hall. She looked at Marcus beside her, his hands still holding hers, palm up, the healed burns visible, everything visible. She thought of Aldrich on his hall steps, watching the cart pull away. She thought of the tithe ledger, her name below the grain sacks, above nothing. She thought of the cold iron pressed against her wrist in a packed earth ring, and the weight of it, and the 3 years of carrying it without a name for what it had cost. None of it was gone. She was not a woman who believed that witnessed reversal erased what had preceded it. But it had been seen, and what had been done had been undone, where undoing was possible. And what could not be undone had been named before 12 council members and 9 alphas and a great hall full of witnesses. And that mattered in ways she did not yet have full language for, but recognized in the same place she had first recognized the warmth in her sternum in a cold cell in Ring 7. Ren's hand settled briefly on her back, as it had in the council chamber. The kneeling assembly waited. Seren looked at Marcus. He was watching her face with the same steadiness she had catalogued across 6 nights in lamplight, and then again in the council chamber on the morning he had walked through the broken door, the steadiness that did not require her to perform anything in return. She did not perform anything. She simply stood on the floor of the great hall at Veldenmere in the morning light, with both palms open, and let herself be still. The hall was hers.